Well, it started out actually in Bordeaux rather than in Champagne. Back in the vintage of 09-10, I had this plan to take the photographs of the top 20 Bordeaux estates. Had a few different people punch in what they thought were the best top 20 estates, so it might not be yours, but there they were. And I was very lucky taking the photographs in 2010. The Bordelais were extremely happy with '09, and they saw themselves getting even wealthier off 10, which was another fantastic vintage. So everybody said yes. I was a bit worried that if Lafite went ahead and went on with the project, that Mouton might not. But everybody was very, very helpful, and that project went ahead, which meant that when I came to do Champagne, I went to the perceivably the best 10 houses. Everybody again said yes, having seen the Bordelais have all their lovely portraits done and a nice exhibition. So that's where the portrait came from, a selection of a series from Bordeaux, Champagne, and then I did Burgundy after that. And of course, Salon was obviously in the top 10 houses of Champagne. The photograph itself, they'd just had that new tasting room built. And I went into it, and it's beautifully circular. And he just stood there talking and so on, and just rested his hands on the table. And I had a camera in hand just to get an idea of the place. And I just suddenly saw this shape of the circle at the bottom, and then him as the stem. So his hands came down as the base of the glass, and the tasting table was the base of the glass. He was the stem, and his head kind of moved into sort of Marie Antoinette champagne glass, and all the light behind him just with the bubbles coming off it. And it just sort of hit me that, okay, this is exactly where we should take the photograph, not in vines or cellars or so on. And we didn't even need a glass to be there. That, you know, I didn't want it to be bottles and glasses and so on. Quite like a lot of the sort of portraits are taken in cellars with bottles and glasses. And so it's just nice that that presented itself to me. And with a little bit of refinement and a little bit of direction, we came up with that portrait. I generally find online very exciting, especially with wine. I find that maybe when I started writing about wine, maybe 6 years ago or so, there were some established blogs. Twitter was still in its infancy. I mean, it had been around since 2009, but people weren't really using it that much to communicate. And Facebook was just getting going in terms of people using it for communication and business rather than just social interaction. But in the last 5 years, that's dramatically changed. Twitter has almost gone over the edge where it's sort of leveled off a little bit. And I found that for the first 5 years or so, it was wine talking to wine. There was a lot of the wine community talking to itself. And although it isn't growing in the same way, I find that Twitter is now starting to talk to consumers. The consumers are actually getting a bit more engaged, or at least that's what I find with my Twitter account. I've had a fairly level-ish following for the last couple of years or so, at around about the 25,000 to 27,000 following mark. And I'm finding that I'm getting more relevant followers, if not so many every month. And I'm finding that they're engaging more as well. Whilst in the past, it was just a lot of banter between wine people and also a lot of spam, quite frankly. So it seems to be a bit more directed. Whether that's happening with the other social media sites, I don't know. But I think with Facebook, it is too. There are more communities than there ever were before online. And then separately to that, I find the whole idea of the searchability online has got so much better. If you want to find something specific, the questioning, the Google searches and so on are very much more directed. And it's easier to find exactly what you want rather than having to wade through lots of meaningless to you, the searcher, content. I think that for me, I like online because it's my shop window in a way. People can see my work, and the work that I get paid for more isn't necessarily online. Although I do find I get work online. I actually get physical jobs through Twitter. People will find me there and communicate with me, and I'll get work from it, which has not happened. It didn't happen at the beginning anyway, sort of 5, 6 years ago. That's been in the last maybe 2 years. So I find that very good from a photographer's point of view. I find that the internet is intrinsically visual. People spend small amounts of time on things. People are not going to read a 5,000 word article on wine. It's unusual for them to do so. However, they will certainly read a short paragraph beneath a photograph. I think this is typified perhaps by the drinks business 10 picks that they do at the end of each week. And I think most of us do flick through them. And I'm not saying that people don't read about wine online. There are some fantastic websites that people do read, and they are pretty in-depth. Jamie Goods, for example, or Jim Budd's. But I think that generally photography has come to the fore. Second to that, I think that photography online for people coming into being a wine photographer is easier. I mean, first of all, let's take it for granted that you're a good photographer and you have an individual style. I think it's easier to shine with the use of online. You can throw your photographs out to the people you want to reach quite easily, which was not possible before. I think that if you're wanting to get into wine photography, and online is a great tool to be able to show people your work, I would say that diversification is the key, not just within wine photography, but just within photography in general. I think that if I were just doing wine photography, I'd struggle. If I was just writing, I would struggle. If I was just doing portraiture, I'd struggle. But adding all these things together, I feel I make an okay living. So I think that diversity is definitely the key. I think that if you're a good photographer, it doesn't matter whether you come from an academic background or whether you've studied photography. I didn't. I studied quantity surveying, and at the age of 30 changed my life and was very lucky and got a job at the Scotsman. So they taught me pretty much everything that I didn't know as an amateur. So no, I'd say that qualifications are really not necessary at all. It's just, are you good? Have you got a good portfolio? What can you show people? I think that climate is going to change things. We already know that 2015 was the hottest year on record. 2016 is the hottest year on record, and it's not going to cool down anytime soon. So this has got to have an impact on the wines that we're drinking. So I think that climate, it will be a big thing. And therefore, the way that governments deal with climate is going to become a big thing. Any of the legislation that they put down now is going to affect what we're going to be drinking in 10 years' time. And one would hope that they would deal with it. Going on to sort of general regulation, with Brexit, it's a little difficult to see how things are going to turn out. But tax, how much we're going to be paying for importing and exporting our own English wines, how that's going to be, it's hard to say. I think there are opportunities. I think that there are opportunities to export to countries that wouldn't normally take our wines, or it'd be more difficult, and vice versa. So although perhaps Brexit was a bit of a surprise, I think in the long run it's possible that we could see a benefit to it. There are also, of course, many downsides to it as well. So I would say that legislation is going to be pretty important going forward for the UK. I think that primarily moderation means to me appreciation. I think if you're drinking beyond just simply appreciating and enjoying the flavors and the tastes and the experience of wine, then you're not really drinking within a moderation. You're drinking to get drunk, which is a completely different thing. I think then there is also moderation from a health perspective, which is probably drinking slightly less than you would just simply for taste and enjoyment. I mean, I can certainly drink more than 2 glasses of wine and still enjoy it and taste it. So Moderation, I think, perhaps means different things to different people. I think that in terms of health, I don't know whether the government has it right or wrong. I think that most of us intrinsically know ourselves if we're drinking too much. Simply on how do you feel the next day? How fit do you feel? Do you think you should drink a little less? If you do, then you're probably right. If you feel fine with what you drink, then you're probably right. I think that self-moderation for most wine drinkers is probably a good way to go, especially wine drinkers who are wanting to enjoy wine for its taste and experience and flavors, rather than just consuming alcohol. I think that in terms of moderation, and how communicators and journalists and broadcasters and so on put that across to the consumer, it's fairly important. I think that we don't talk about moderation in drinking enough, actually. I think that we quite freely talk about all this wine, but we don't talk about its intrinsic consumption. And I think that it's important that journalists do put across this message of moderation, not drinking too much, because people, I think, eventually will take it on board. So, yeah, I think it's important that journalists do express, not all the time, obviously, but from time to time, it's a good thing to do. I think that now, and maybe in the sort of short-term future, I think it's still the big retailers that are going to dictate what we're drinking en masse. I suppose it's into two different categories. It's the people that are going to go into a supermarket and spend £5 on a bottle of wine. They're going to be dictated to probably by the retailer. However, if you are wanting to spend £10 on a bottle of wine, then I think that is where a journalist's input becomes very important. I know that if somebody mentions a particular wine that's above £5, for example, there was a Portuguese wine not so long ago that James Martin mentioned on the telly, and Majestic immediately sold out because it was about £8, and he said it was the best wine he'd tasted that year. So I think that journalists and broadcasters definitely have an impact once somebody has gone beyond just wanting something to drink, and into actually wanting something to taste and experience and enjoy. So I think that in that, writers, journalists, broadcasters becoming more important. Online certainly comes into that because all these people are using digital medium. So as we go forward, I think that the more people we drag out of the £5 bracket, I'm not saying that I never buy a bottle of wine at £5, but you can then, I see digital really benefiting people in the choices that they make. It's far easier. You don't have to find a hard copy of the Telegraph. You can just do a search and see what Victoria has recommended that week, or any of the other writers will at the Times or whatever. It's just so much more accessible. And I think that the access to journalists' ideas, thoughts, recommendations can only be beneficial through a digital medium. I think that people who are using both platforms will realize and will know that both complement each other. I think if you're starting out in the world of wine, then you can start online, and that can grow into writing for traditional media. And it can also, in the reverse, if you're writing from a traditional media point of view, you can then easily have a following online. If you're a broadcaster, for example, you have a pretty good audience using, let's say, television. And if you were then to start a blog, you would get a large following. And then again, in the reverse, if you have a blog and then you suddenly went onto TV, people would know who you are because you'd probably have a fairly successful blog. So I think that the two work hand in hand. I think that the younger generation will consume their information from wine journalists probably more online in the future. I think that that's obvious from what we've seen in the last few years. But there will still be a role for that traditional media, I think. Even if people are consuming their general information in a different way, they're going to still sit down and pick up a paper occasionally, read, watch BBC Two and so on. So I think they go hand in hand if you can do it. I think that in terms of having a traditional media that generally that's where the income comes from. If you're a broadcaster, you're going to make more money than you are sitting doing a webcam or a YouTube on wine. But I don't think that the people who generally are on TV, the new people coming onto TV, would be there without the social media side of things beforehand growing their popularity. I think that if you didn't want to use a digital medium to gain popularity and notoriety, it would be quite hard. Writing a book, yeah, okay, that's a very good way to go. But then you're still going to need the digital media to be able to publicize and even publish the book. So I think it's all digital is all important, and it may not be where you physically get your income from, but it's intrinsic to where you get your income from that you use digital media. Well, right now, I've been actually more involved in the whiskey world. I edit a magazine called Whiskey Quarterly, which started 2 years ago, which is I'm very lucky actually. It's a very nice, luxury, glossy mag all about, well, not all about whiskey actually. I've managed to get some wine into there. So we've got a lovely big article on champagne coming up into Christmas. Richard Hemming has written us a lovely article on how to decipher a fine wine menu. And we're going to continue having more wine and food in the magazine. I'm finding that whiskey drinkers are not just whiskey drinkers. They like to drink wine too, and vice versa. So there's a nice crossover between those two worlds. I'm still being able to continue my photography through that. I do all the front covers and so on. But what I'd really like to do, if I could find the time, would be to continue the wine portraits that I did, and perhaps do a series from the Rhone or California or Australia. It's just time. I think that in these days when you're we're all busy. Most communicators and wine are pretty busy people. It's finding, the time. California or Australia would need probably a month. The Rhone, that might come first. It's a little easier to access, but we'll see.